General demanded her call sign. When she said Specter 6, the room went silent. Part 1. The name that stopped a room, the Pentagon. E-ring, 4th floor. The room had no windows. It didn't need them. The men who met in rooms like this one didn't come to look outside. They came to decide what happened out there in the deserts, in the mountains, in the kind of darkness that never made the evening news. 8 men sat around a table made of oak so old it had absorbed 30 years of classified conversations. Their combined service time exceeded 2 centuries. Their medals, if laid flat, would cover the table twice over. The youngest man in the room was 51. The oldest had buried friends in 4 different conflicts and carried the weight of those funerals in the permanent set of his jaw. At the far end of the table, in the chair closest to the door, sat a young woman, 26 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall. Dark hair pulled back with the kind of precision that had nothing to do with vanity. Her uniform carried no rank insignia, no unit patch, no name tape. She sat with her spine perfectly straight and her hands folded on the table in front of her, and she had not moved, not shifted, not glanced around the room, not betrayed a single flicker of discomfort since the moment she walked in. The men had noticed her. Men like these noticed everything. But noticing and understanding were 2 different things, and not one of them in that moment understood what they were looking at. Lieutenant General Harold Voss sat at the head of the table, 63 years old, former commander of the Joint Special Operations Command, the kind of man who had spent 4 decades making decisions that younger men would spend their entire careers trying to comprehend. His face was the color of old concrete and roughly the same texture. He did not smile easily. He did not waste words. And he had not survived this long by ignoring the things that made his instincts fire without warning. Something about the woman at the end of his table was making his instincts fire right now. He picked up the pen in front of him, set it back down, looked at the file open to his left, a file he had read 3 times since 6 that morning. Then he looked at her again. "We'll begin with call signs," he said. His voice carried the authority of someone who had never once needed to raise it to be heard. "Standard protocol, each of you in turn." He started at his left and worked clockwise around the table. The men answered in sequence, clean, practiced. Each call sign delivered with the flat confidence of someone who had used it so many times it had become more real than their given name. He reached the end. He looked at her. She looked back at him without blinking. "And you," he said. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she spoke. "Specter 6. The room changed. It didn't make a sound. That was the thing. There was no audible reaction, no gasp, no exclamation. But something passed through the air in that room like a pressure wave, like the moment before a detonation when the atmosphere itself seems to understand what's coming. Brigadier General Tom Eckhart, who had spent 30 years in military intelligence and prided himself on having the emotional range of a stone wall, sat up half an inch straighter and lost the color from his face. Colonel Dale Whitmore, who bore a scar from his jaw to his collarbone from a mission in a country that officially didn't happen, set his pen down with the delicate care of a man who needed something to do with his hands. The 2 men in civilian clothing, seated against the wall and introduced to no one, exchanged a glance. It lasted less than a second. She caught it anyway. And Harold Voss, the man who had ordered helicopter assaults into hostile territory in the dark, who had written condolence letters to 17 different families, who had sat across from senators and 4-star generals, and never once allowed his composure to develop a crack. Harold Voss set his pen down, and his hand was not entirely steady when he did it. The silence lasted 4 seconds. It felt like much longer. Where Voss said, and his voice was still controlled, but something behind it was not, "Did you get that call sign?" The young woman did not flinch, did not look away, did not offer the deference that every other person in this room had spent their careers learning to extend to a man with 3 stars on his collar. She reached into the leather case beside her chair. She placed an object on the table, a notebook. Small, battered, the cover worn to the color of tobacco in old use. The binding had been repaired twice with electrical tape. The lower right corner bore the ghost of a stamp, a unit designation that had no business being in this room in the hands of a 26-year-old woman with no rank insignia. "From the man who created it," she said. Nobody spoke. The oak table held its secrets. The fluorescent lights hummed. And 8 of the most powerful military men in the United States government sat in a room with a young woman none of them had invited, staring at a notebook that should not exist. This is the story of how she got there, and what she was willing to do once she did. Her name was Maya Calloway. She had been born in the fall of 1997 in Arlington, Virginia, which is either an accident of geography or the most fitting birthplace imaginable for the granddaughter of a man who spent his career fighting for the country buried in its soil. Her mother had been a schoolteacher. Her father had worked for a private logistics firm that contracted with the Department of Defense, a polite way of saying he spent his days adjacent to the machinery of national security without ever being allowed inside it. She grew up in a house with a modest yard and a basketball hoop nobody used, and a father who read military history the way other men watch football obsessively urgently, as though the answers to questions he couldn't quite articulate were hidden somewhere in the accounts of Chosen Reservoir and Operation Eagle Claw and the rain-soaked streets of Mogadishu. She did not fully understand until she was older what drove him, but she understood the notebook. He had shown it to her when she was 14. He had kept it wrapped in an old flannel shirt in the back of his closet for as long as she could remember, and the day he took it out and set it on the kitchen table between them was the day she understood that her family's history was not what she had been told it was. The notebook had belonged to her grandfather, Master Sergeant Raymond Calloway, United States Army, Delta Force, a man she had never met, a man who officially had died in 1993 in Mogadishu, Somalia, during one of the most brutal urban engagements American forces had experienced since the streets of Wuyi City a generation before. Officially. The notebook told a different story, or the beginning of one. The entries were technical at first: ballistic calculations, field notes, weapons, specifications, observations on wind and elevation, and the way temperature affected a projectile across distance. The handwriting was precise and economical. The writing of a man who had learned to put words on paper the same way he did everything else efficiently without waste. But toward the end, the handwriting changed. It became slower, more deliberate, like each word was being chosen with great care by someone who understood he might not get another chance. Maya had read those final pages so many times she could recite them from memory. She could recite the last line in particular. The man who pulled me out wounded in the left shoulder doing it. If I don't make it back, find him and don't kill him. She grew up. She ran 4 miles every morning before the sun came up. She had started at 13 after reading about the physical standards required of special forces candidates and had not stopped since. She learned to shoot from her father, who had learned from fragments, the notebook, the stories, the few photographs, and who turned out to have inherited a gift for it the way some families pass down musical ability. By 17, she could consistently group 5 shots within 3 inches at 500 yards with a bolt-action rifle. Her father photographed the targets and said nothing for a long moment, and then told her that her grandfather would have been pleased. She went to college, studied intelligence analysis, graduated a semester early, took a position with a private firm that contracted with the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is where the next part of her education began, the part that no university offered and no official institution would have sanctioned if they had known it was happening. She was 26 years old and had been preparing for this day for her entire adult life. The apartment she kept in Arlington was 20 minutes from the Pentagon, a 1-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a building that backed against a parking structure. She had chosen it for the exits, 3 of them not counting the fire escape, and for the fact that the structure blocked sightlines from the east. The furniture was minimal. A bed, a desk, a single bookshelf, a table with 2 chairs, though she had never had 2 people at it simultaneously. The walls were bare except for one, a large topographic map covered in a constellation of notations in red pen. Lines and circles and cryptic abbreviations that would have meant nothing to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. They were looking at 12 years of research. Under the mattress, a habit she had developed by reading her grandfather's notes and then doing the thing he described, until it became reflex, was a Sig Sauer P226. Cleaned the previous evening. Reassembled in the dark in 44 seconds flat, because darkness was when you needed it, and darkness was when your hands had to remember without your eyes. On the bookshelf, no fiction. Field manuals, ballistics textbooks, a history of 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta, the real one, not the Hollywood version. 2 volumes on the events in Somalia in October of 1993, both heavily annotated. And on the desk in the center of the otherwise clear surface, the notebook. The worn cover, the repaired binding, the last entry written in a hand that had been running out of time. She had read it that morning. She read it every morning, not because she needed to remember she had memorized every word years ago, but because the act of reading it was the act of recommitting to the thing she had decided to do. Every morning she needed to recommit because what she was doing was the kind of thing that required the decision to be made fresh each day. She had run her 4 miles. She had made coffee. She had sat at the desk and read the notebook. Then she had changed into her uniform, the one without insignia, without rank, without anything that would tell the men in that room who she was before she chose to tell them, and driven to the Pentagon. The officer who met her in the lobby was a captain, 32, maybe 33, with the bearing of someone who had spent a decade being the most capable person in whatever room he occupied. He looked at her credentials. He looked at her. He looked at her credentials again. "You're sure you have the right building," he said. It was meant to be dismissive. He had the tone exactly right, the kind of casual diminishment that was technically deniable but landed with the precision of something practiced. She handed him the badge and waited. He led her through 3 checkpoints and 2 sets of security doors and down a corridor where the floor was the same gray linoleum that had been there since the building went up in 1943. She did not require him to speak to her. She had known it would be like this. She had prepared for it. The preparation was not about hardening herself against the contempt. It was about learning to exist inside it without letting it move her. A lesson from the notebook. One of the first entries. Stay still when they want you to fidget. Breathe when they want you to hold your breath. The body gives away what the mind is fighting to keep. She had been practicing stillness for 12 years. The room with no windows. The oak table. The 8 men. The silence after she spoke. She watched Harold Voss look at the notebook she had placed before him. She watched him look at her. She watched something pass through his expression, something swift and complex and quickly controlled, and she stored it in the way she stored everything that mattered, completely, without conclusion, to be retrieved when the retrieval served a purpose. Voss said, "I'll ask you to step outside while we—" "No," she said. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Around the table, men who had not been surprised by anything in decades absorbed it. Voss looked at her for a long moment. "Excuse me, I won't step outside." She held his gaze without blinking. "But I'll make you a trade. Give me 5 minutes and I'll give you something worth more than anything in your current operational package." The silence stretched. She reached back into the leather case and produced a USB drive. She set it on the table beside the notebook. "Play the first video file," she said. "Then decide." Nobody moved. Then Whitmore leaned forward, took the drive, and inserted it into the laptop at his elbow without looking at Voss for permission, which told her something useful about the internal dynamics of the room. The video was 48 seconds long. She had filmed it herself 6 months ago at a private range in Nevada. No camera crew, no spotter, just a tripod, a timer, and the Remington 700 she had carried in a case on the passenger seat for the 3-day drive from Virginia. The screen filled with a view from above the firing position. The conditions were documented in the lower corner of the frame: temperature 94 degrees Fahrenheit, wind 12 miles per hour cross direction, elevation 4,200 feet above sea level, distance to target 800 meters. Through the footage, she watched herself settle into the position, not lowering herself into it, but becoming part of it, like something that had grown there. She spent 40 seconds doing nothing visible, made 3 small adjustments to the scope. Then she breathed in a specific way that no one watching would recognize unless they had spent significant time behind a precision rifle. She was calculating the elevation correction, 28.5 minutes of angle for bullet drop at that distance. She was calculating wind drift, accounting for the way a 12-mile-per-hour crosswind would push a .338 Lapua Magnum projectile approximately 11 inches right over 800 meters. She was accounting for the Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth itself, which at that distance and latitude added a variable that separated hits from misses. She had learned all of this from the notebook. Her grandfather's calculations, adapted for conditions kept alive in the margins of a book the Department of Defense did not know existed. In the footage, the rifle moved once. A small thing. The sound reached this camera a fraction of a second later. Whitmore clicked to the second file. The target photographed immediately after, with a scale reference, filled the screen. A circle the size of a $50 around the center point. The bullet hole was inside it, 1.2 inches from the mathematical center, at 800 meters. In those conditions, alone. Eckhart said quietly, almost to himself, "Who taught you to shoot like that?" She looked at him. "My grandfather," indirectly. She touched the corner of the notebook. "He wrote it all down." The room was different now. Not warm, it would not become warm, but the specific quality of the dismissiveness had shifted. She had walked through a door that most people in her position would not have been able to reach, and the men around the table were recalibrating. She could see it in the way they held themselves. She did not allow herself to feel satisfaction. Satisfaction was a door left open. She would close it late in private, if at all. The briefing that followed was thorough and compressed. Voss outlined the operation in the spare information-dense language of a man who had given thousands of briefings and had long since stripped them of everything that wasn't load-bearing. There was a target, a network, a history of weapons transfers to organizations responsible for the deaths of Americans and their allies across 3 continents in the past 18 months. The CIA had lost 2 officers attempting to penetrate the network. The conventional intelligence apparatus had reached the limits of what it could accomplish from outside. The target's operational designation was the Warden. His actual identity was unknown. What was known was the shape of his operation, disciplined, compartmented run, with the methodology of someone trained at a level most people on the planet never experienced. He had been active for approximately 20 years. Before that, the record was gaps in deliberate erasure of the kind that required institutional assistance. She listened to all of it on. She asked 2 questions, both technical, both from someone who had already absorbed the material and was checking specific details rather than establishing foundational understanding. Eckhart's eyes moved to her when she asked the second one, Brum. She was admitted to the team. She did not show what that cost her to receive as a gift rather than a right. She nodded once and gathered the notebook from the table and put it back in her case and thanked the room in the language of protocol and economy. She drove back to the apartment in the early afternoon, made tea, sat at the desk. The operational file on the Warden was in the second folder of the drive she had given them. She had kept a copy. She had kept everything. She read the file again now slowly, not for the large things she had absorbed those months ago, but for the small ones. The details that existed in the spaces between confirmed facts. The Warden's recorded injury history included a shoulder wound, left shoulder, sustained during an operation in East Africa, 1993, Mogadishu. She set the folder down. She looked at the last page of the notebook, the handwriting that had slowed and grown deliberate and chosen every word with the care of a man who understood he might not get another chance. The man who pulled me out wounded in the left shoulder doing it. She looked at the wall, at the topographic map covered in red notations accumulated over 12 years, at all the work, all the patience. She had walked into the most secure building in the American military apparatus. She had said the name that no one in that room had spoken in 31 years. She had earned a seat at a table built for men twice her age. And the man she had just been assigned to find and eliminate the man the CIA had burned 2 officers trying to reach bore the exact wound her grandfather had described in the last entry he ever wrote. Don't kill him. Outside, the light was going. The city was doing what cities do, indifferent and enormous and full of people living their ordinary lives. She stayed at the window until the orange left the sky and the city settled into its nighttime register. Then she went back to the desk. She opened the notebook to the last page. She read it once more, not because she needed to, but because she needed to. Then she closed it, set it beside the case she would pack in the morning. The room with no windows had made its decision. Now she would make hers. Part 2, The Dead Don't Forget. The mountains of Western Virginia in November look like something that has decided to be serious about itself. The trees have surrendered their color. The ridgelines are hard and bare against a sky that cannot make up its mind between gray and white. The roads that lead into the valleys where the government keeps its quieter operations are unmarked on any civilian map, and the facilities at the end of those roads are not what you see in movies. No gleaming corridors, no banks of monitors. What you find instead, if you are cleared to find it, is something closer to a working farm converted into a place where people practice the art of staying alive in situations designed to kill them. The compound sat in a shallow valley 3 miles from the nearest paved road. 4 buildings, a long open area that served as both vehicle access and improvised range. A smaller structure at the tree line housing equipment no one discussed and everyone used. The whole thing registered on aerial imagery as a series of unremarkable rectangles in the trees, which was exactly the intention. Maya arrived early on the 3rd day after the Pentagon briefing. She had driven through the pre-dawn hours. The notebook was in the case on the passenger seat, as it always was when she traveled. The Remington was in the trunk, broken down and secured in the foam-lined case she had owned since she was 19. She parked beside 3 vehicles she didn't recognize, got out, stood in the cold air, looked at the mountains and breathed. This was not a ritual of appreciation. It was information gathering, smell, sound, the direction of the wind, the quality of the light, the things that were present and those that were conspicuously absent. Her grandfather had written about it in the notebook's early pages. You arrive at a location already knowing it, or you arrive already behind. There is no neutral. She learned the location, then she went inside. Four of them were waiting in the main building's briefing room, which was also where they ate and where the operational maps were pinned to a board that had been used so many times the cork had gone gray from repeated puncturing. Folding chairs, a table inferior in every way to the oak one at the Pentagon. Better coffee, though. She noted that immediately. Declan Rourke was standing when she came in, 39 years old, lean in the way of men who have spent years in aircraft that don't have room for anything extra. He had the stillness of someone who had logged thousands of hours in helicopters at low altitude in the dark over terrain that was trying to kill him, and had learned that stillness was not the absence of alertness, but its highest expression. Formerly of the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, whose reputation for precision flight operations under impossible conditions was the kind of thing that made other special operations units grateful they existed. He looked at Maya when she entered, said nothing. That told her something. Cole Hadley was seated and eating from a container of leftover rice with the body language of a man who understood that food was fuel, and fuel was not to be wasted regardless of timing. 33 years old, 190 pounds of former Ranger Battalion Post-Ranger Sewam, or paramilitary. The kind of physical architecture that suggested someone had built a human being specifically for moving through obstacles. A scar above his left eyebrow he had never explained to anyone. A laugh that arrived without warning and departed the same way. He looked up at Maya, looked at her case, looked at her face, and went back to his food. Evelyn Pruitt was reviewing a medical kit in the corner, with the systematic attention of someone who had learned not to trust anyone else's preparation. 36 years old, flight surgeon cross-trained in trauma medicine and SERE instruction, survival evasion resistance escape, which meant she had spent time both teaching soldiers how to survive captivity and in the classified portions of her record learning what happened when they didn't. She wore her hair in a practical braid and had the kind of quiet competence that made you recalibrate your expectations about 2 minutes into observing her because she didn't look like what she was until she needed to. And then there was Nathaniel Vane. He was at the far end of the table reading something on a tablet, and he did not look up when Maya entered. 41 with a face that was neither remarkable nor forgettable, and the specific presence that good intelligence operatives develop over years of practice, the ability to be in a room without the room quite registering him. A SIGINT specialist with a secondary background in human, operating at the intersection of electronic surveillance and human intelligence, where the most interesting and most dangerous information lived. He looked up eventually. His eyes moved across Maya with the quality of something being cataloged rather than observed. Not hostile, not curious, cataloging. Something about it made her want to keep watching him. She stored the observation and let it sit. The briefing that followed was thorough and compressed, delivered by Rourke with the economy of someone who understood that operational time was a resource, and wasting it in a briefing room was the same as wasting it anywhere else. The target's network had identified Warsaw as a transit point. The warden was moving a final consignment before going dark, the pattern consistent with someone who understood surveillance cycles and had the discipline to disappear before the next one began. They had a 48-hour window, possibly less. Poland in November was cold in a way that Virginia in November was not. The cold there had intention behind it, coming down off the Baltic and the plains, without geographic interruption to take the edge off. Warsaw had been rebuilt after the Second World War, with the particular determination of a city that understood it had been erased and refused to accept erasure as permanent. The rebuilt streets had a quality of assertion to them, a deliberateness in the architecture that you didn't find in cities that had never been destroyed. Maya noted the street width, the sight lines, the construction materials, and what they implied about penetration and cover. She did this without effort, the way someone with perfect pitch hears intervals. It had been trained into her by the notebook, and then by years of practice, and then by more years of practice, until the practice became indistinguishable from instinct. The team moved into operational positions across the city with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before in other cities under other names. No one announced themselves. No one moved faster than the ambient rhythm of the streets around them. Maya's position was on the 4th floor of a building that a local property management company rented to a shell corporation in the DIA's operational infrastructure for 11 years. The window on the north face overlooked a market square in continuous commercial use since the 15th century, which now hosted, among other things, a cafe serving as the designated meeting point. 600 meters. She had ranged it twice with different instruments and gotten the same number both times. She settled in, set up the Remington. adjusted the scope for the light conditions, flat gray overcast, which actually simplified certain calculations. No sun angle to account for. She settled into position and became part of the floor. Through the scope, the square came into fine resolution, the cobblestones, the market stalls, the cafe with its empty exterior tables, the ordinary population of a European city in the late morning, moving with the purposeful haste of people who have somewhere to be and would rather be there. Rourke was in a vehicle 2 blocks north with the electronic surveillance package. Hadley and Pruitt were on foot in the market area playing tourists with the specific lost-looking quality that made the performance convincing. Vane was in a secondary static position, monitoring communications channels. The contact arrived at 11:43 local time. Maya picked him up 40 meters before he reached the cafe. She had been given photographs and descriptions, but what she noticed first was not his face but his gait, the slight compensation in his right hip that spoke of an old injury managed rather than healed, the way he moved his head in small scanning arcs that most people would read as someone looking for a friend. She read it as counter-surveillance technique. He was not a civilian. Whatever else he had been trained. She tracked him to the cafe entrance. He went inside. She repositioned slightly to maintain the sightline through the window. He ordered coffee he did not drink. He sat with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door, correct technique, and it told her more about his background. She ran her eyes across his clothing the way the notebook had described, not fashion function. What the clothing said about the person wearing it, what it concealed or projected, what the details in the margins revealed that the main garment was meant to distract from. The lapel of his jacket, left side, a small badge, the kind of thing that in Washington would be instantly recognizable as the identification credential of a Capitol Hill staff member, a specific shape, a specific color, coding worn slightly carelessly, the way people wear things they put on every day and stop seeing. She stared at it. She recalibrated the scope, zoomed to its practical maximum for identification rather than engagement. The badge came into resolution, imperfect, but workable. She needed confirmation. "Ghost," she said into the radio, her voice level. "I need you to run the visual feed on the primary target. Zoom on the lapel badge left side. Tell me what you see." Rourke's voice came back after 8 seconds. "Running it? Stand by." She kept watching. The contact was still alone. What agency issues that credential format? 15 seconds of silence. Then Rourke, "I'm cross-referencing." Another pause. "Maya, that's a Senate staff credential. I can't confirm the specific office from this resolution, but the format is consistent with..." The contact's head came up from his coffee cup. He looked toward the door. He had sensed something, whatever it was, had changed his assessment of the room he was in. He began to rise from his chair. The window in front of him produced a single fracture very fast. He was falling before the sound reached anyone in the square. By the time it did reach them, by the time the ordinary population of the cafe understood what they were hearing, the contact was already on the floor, and the person who had fired was already gone. The shot had come from the northwest. She had the angle immediately, had run the geometry in the time it took the glass to fall. But there was nothing to see. Whoever had made that shot had made it from a prepared position and had exited in the seconds between trigger pull and impact, not improvised. This was someone with training equivalent to her own running a prepared operation with a prepared exit. Someone had known about this meeting. She said into the radio, "Exfil, all elements, primary contact is down. Shooter unknown, position northwest already gone." A pause, then Rourke. "Understood. Rally point Charlie, 15 minutes. She broke down the Remington in the practiced sequence, each component going into its designated place with the efficiency of a process reduced to pure muscle memory. She was out of the building in 4 minutes. At the rally point, they were all present and silent for a long moment. The silence of people absorbing an operation that had become something different from what it was planned to be. Hadley said, "Someone burned the meeting." No one argued. It was the only assessment that fit. Maya said, "How many people knew the contact's identity and location?" The question landed in the room and sat there. The answer, which no one spoke aloud, but which everyone understood, was only the people inside the operational chain of command that had planned this mission. A very small number of people, all of them with the highest clearances the United States government issued. Vane was quiet since they arrived at the rally point, standing near the window with his arms crossed and his eyes on the street, nothing in his posture readable as anything other than professional concern. Maya watched him in her peripheral vision and kept her face pointed at the operational map. There was something in his stillness that was different from Rourke's stillness. Rourke was still because he was processing. Vane was still because he had already finished processing and was waiting for something. She stored the observation. Let it sit. That night, alone in the room assigned to her in the safe house, she pulled the operational file she had been given at the Pentagon and spread it on the table. The chain of command for this mission ran upward through a structure she had memorized in the first 24 hours. She traced it now with her finger slowly the way you trace a route on a map, not because you don't know where you're going, but because you need to confirm the roads haven't changed. The authorization chain terminated at JSOC command. And the current JSOC command structure, the specific office through which this operation had been approved, ran through one person at its apex, Harold Voss. She had known this. She had known his name before she walked into the Pentagon. She had found it 3 years into her research in a declassified Inspector General report from 1994 that mentioned in a single subordinate clause the acting deputy commander of a special activities unit in East Africa in October 1993. She had not known until this moment whether that connection made him complicit or simply proximate. But someone in the chain above this operation had authorized a secondary mandate for one of its members. That authorization required a signature, and there was only one signature with the authority to issue it. She looked at the wall of the safe house and at nothing in particular. Voss didn't just build the command structure that had sent them here. He had been in the architecture of this thing from the beginning, from October 1993, when a man named Raymond Calloway had found something he was not supposed to find and had been left to die rather than be allowed to bring it home. She folded the file, put it back in the case. There was nothing more to say about it tonight. What mattered now was what came next. 2 days later, they were an hour from Krakow. The warehouse had been identified through signals intelligence Vane had been pulling since Warsaw. A transit point, not a headquarters, not an armory, but a logistical node in the distribution network that the warden had been running for 2 decades. Somewhere inside it was the connection that would either confirm or destroy the theory about what the warden's operation actually was. They went in at 3 in the morning, Hadley and Maya from the east, Rourke in the vehicle providing electronic overwatch, Pruitt on the western perimeter, Vane in a secondary interior position once entry was established. The entry was clean. The IR spoofing device Rourke had provided neutralized the exterior camera network in precisely the window he had promised 90 seconds of blindness. They moved through it with the economy of people who understood that silence was not just the absence of sound, but the management of every variable that produced it. The gravel, the door seal, the floor surface inside. Maya cataloged each one and adjusted her footfall accordingly. The interior was not what she had expected. No weapons, no armory. What the warehouse held was the infrastructure of information filing cabinets, a server rack running on a dedicated power supply, a desk with equipment 2 generations more sophisticated than the building suggested. Whoever operated from here was not a crude actor. This was the workspace of someone trained in operational security at a level that matched or exceeded anything she had encountered. Vane went to the server equipment. Rourke's voice in her earpiece confirmed he was pulling data from the exterior. Maya went to the filing cabinets. She worked methodically, not looking for anything specific, because looking for something specific was how you missed everything else. Looking at everything, letting the categories emerge rather than imposing them. The third drawer she opened contained physical files. Paper. In a world where everything was digital, the most sensitive material was sometimes kept on paper precisely because paper left no network signature, generated no access log, could not be reached by anyone who did not already know where to look. She read through the logistics files quickly. Movement records, transit schedules, the operational language of a network that had been running for 2 decades with the discipline of someone trained in exactly this kind of security architecture. Near the back of the drawer behind the current operational files was a section that was older. The paper had the brittleness of documents carried through multiple locations over many years, not filed and forgotten, but moved deliberately, kept close, transferred from one secure location to the next, with the care of something irreplaceable. This was not logistics material. This was someone's personal record. The kind of thing an operator keeps, not because it is operationally necessary, but because some things cannot be left behind, regardless of the cost of carrying them. She understood this immediately. She kept a notebook and a flannel shirt in a case on the passenger seat of her car. She understood exactly what it meant to carry something that had no tactical value in every other kind. A manila envelope, older than the other files. She lifted it carefully, opened it. 3 photographs. The first 2 were operational locations, structures, nothing personal. The third one stopped her breathing. It was taken in poor light outdoors in conditions of obvious dust and heat. The composition was accidental. The photographer had been pointing the camera at something else and caught the edge of this moment by chance or by the unconscious instinct of someone who understood that what they were seeing mattered. Two figures, one supporting the other. The supported figure was facing slightly toward the camera. His clothing was torn and dark with what she recognized immediately as blood. She knew his face. She had never seen it in a photograph before, but she knew it the way you know a face seen in fragments, in the shape of your father's jaw, in the structure of certain expressions, in the inheritance of bone and proportion that genetics distributes across generations, whether or not those generations ever meet. Her grandfather, alive, after Mogadishu. She turned the photograph over. On the back in handwriting that was not his, he trusted me with his life. I gave him a new one. The figure supporting him in the photograph facing away from the camera, shoulder pulled down at an angle that spoke of a wound caught mid-motion. Left shoulder. She put the photograph in her inside pocket, closed the drawer, stood up. She began moving toward the exit point, and then she looked at Vane. He was at the server, equipment as designated, but he was not doing what he had been doing 60 seconds ago. His hands were in a different position, completing a motion small and deliberate, the movement of someone finishing a task rather than continuing one. The task was not the data pull that Rourke was monitoring from outside. She watched him withdraw a small device from the back of the server unit and pocket it. Then she watched him resume the posture of someone doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. 6 seconds, from the moment she had last confirmed his position to the moment she looked at him again. 6 seconds in which he had done something not in the operational plan. He did not look at her. He had no reason to. She was where she was supposed to be doing what she was supposed to be doing. She kept her face forward and her breathing even and continued toward the exit. The alarm sounded from the upper level, a secondary sensor that Rourke's sweep had not caught. The sequence that followed was fast and tight, Hadley clearing the path south, Maya on rear security, Rourke pulling the vehicle into the extraction lane, Pruitt moving from the perimeter, Vane moving with the group. She kept him in her peripheral vision the entire way out. Everyone moved at the pace the extraction plan specified, except Vane for 6 seconds, who moved at a fractionally different pace than he should have. Not enough that anyone else would notice. She noticed. In the vehicle, the team was quiet in the way that successful extractions from compromised positions produce the adrenaline beginning its slow subsidence, the inventory of what had happened replacing the reflexive management of it. Rourke drove. Hadley watched the mirrors. Pruitt had her eyes closed in the way of someone not sleeping but running through something internally. Vane was looking at his phone. Maya looked out the window at the pre-dawn streets of southern Poland. She waited until they were back at the operational safe house, until the team had dispersed to their assigned rooms, until the building had settled into the quieter rhythms of the hours before dawn. Then she knocked on Rourke's door. He opened it immediately. Men with his background rarely slept in the immediate aftermath of an operation. She came in. She told him what she had seen Vane do at the server equipment. She kept it precise and brief, fact sequence, duration, her assessment of what the motion was consistent with. She did not yet tell him what she had found in the envelope. Rourke listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. There was an RF signal in the vehicle during exfil, he said. I picked it up on the monitoring equipment and logged it as environmental interference because the frequency was close to the local cell infrastructure. He paused. It wasn't environmental. She looked at him. It was a tracking device, he said. Compact, short-range relay. The kind of thing you use when you want to establish a location for another team to act on. He looked at the wall. Someone now knows exactly where this safe house is. She absorbed this, integrated it with the photograph, with the left shoulder and the handwriting, and what it meant about who Robert Ashford, the warden, actually was and what he had actually done in Mogadishu 31 years ago, the man her grandfather's notebook had told her not to kill. She pulled out the photograph and placed it on the table between them. Rourke looked at it for a long time. He looked at the handwriting on the back. He looked at her. She said, the warden's network is not supplying the organizations the agency says it is. It's supplying the groups fighting against those organizations, the groups standing in opposition to interests that someone powerful in Washington has been protecting for 30 years. Rourke was quiet. Robert Ashford is not the enemy, she said. He's fighting the same thing that killed my grandfather's reputation and my father in 12 years of my life. He's been doing what my grandfather would have done if he'd made it home, from a different direction. She looked at Rourke. He was watching her with the patient stillness of a man who understood he was waiting for something important to be said and was content to wait for it properly. She said, "I need to find him before the operational plan does." He looked at her for a long time. "Then we have about 48 hours," he said, "before the chain of command figures out we're looking." She nodded. "I know." She did not open the notebook that night. She had read it enough times that opening it was no longer necessary for the purpose it had always served: the recommitment, the renewal of decision. The decision had already been made. It had been made the moment she saw the photograph. It had been made 31 years before she was born, in a city she had never visited, by a man she had never met, who had chosen to write things down rather than let them die with him. She placed the photograph on the table. She placed her hand flat over it. She held it there in the dark, in the quiet of the safe house, with Rourke on the other side of the wall running calculations that she did not need to hear to know the outcome of. 48 hours. The man at the end of this was not the man they had told her he was. She had built space in the architecture of her preparation for exactly this contingency, not because she had known, but because she had suspected, and suspicion, in her experience, was almost always worth the cost of preparing for it. She took her hand off the photograph, picked up the Remington case, and checked the components she had already checked 3 times. Then she put it down. Then she lay on the cot without closing her eyes and waited for the 48 hours to begin. Part 3. Specter doesn't die twice. The southern edge of Poland, where the land begins its long argument with the Carpathian Mountains, is not a place that makes itself easy for strangers. The villages there have the quality of things that have survived by being overlooked. The roads narrow without announcement. The forests press close to the shoulders of the pavement and hold their darkness even in the middle of the day. The trees grown tall enough and dense enough that the light reaching the ground is filtered down to something thin and conditional. Maya drove with Rourke navigating from the passenger seat using a mapping application loaded onto a phone purchased with cash at a market stall in Warsaw 2 days earlier. They had left the safe house at 4 in the morning. They had told no one. This was the part with no procedure. Everything up to this point had been executable within frameworks. She had either been given or built herself over 12 years of preparation. But this driving into the mountains of southern Poland before dawn, operating entirely outside the chain of command following a thread assembled from a 31-year-old photograph and her grandfather's handwriting, this had no framework. This was the part where the framework ended and something else had to take its place. She drove. She breathed. She kept her speed consistent. Rourke was quiet in the way he was always quiet, the quiet of a man with something to think about who was thinking about it. He had not asked her what she expected to find. He had not offered probability assessments. He had simply gotten into the vehicle at 4 in the morning with his equipment case and his personal weapon, and the expression of someone who had made a decision and was finished making it. She appreciated that more than she had words to say. Behind them in the safe house they had left, Nathaniel Vane had not yet realized they were gone. She had approximately 2 hours before the morning check-in would reveal their absence, and another hour after that before Vane would exhaust the explanations that didn't require him to report upward. 3 hours total before the chain of command became aware that 2 members of the operational team had gone off the grid. After that, the clock would accelerate. In Washington, in an office suite on the 3rd floor of the Russell Senate office building, a man named Gerald Marsh was beginning his working day. 67 years old, silver-haired. The institutional gravitas that accumulates in a person after 3 decades of being the one in the room who outlasts everyone else. He was the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, which meant that every major defense appropriation passed through his office. He had shaped over 30 years the financial architecture of the American military in ways that were visible to everyone, and the financial relationships that ran alongside that architecture in ways that were visible to no one. He had been careful for 30 years. He had built his caution the way he had built everything else, systematically, 1 layer of insulation at a time. The connection that Ray Calloway had found documented in Mogadishu in October of 1993 was the original thread. Every careful thing Gerald Marsh had done since then was an act of ensuring that thread could never be pulled. He was on the phone before 8. His aide had flagged an overnight report from the operational team in Poland. Something had gone wrong in Krakow. The contact was down. The team had exfiled. No casualties on their side, but the girl was still operational. The girl who had walked into a Pentagon briefing and said a name that should have been buried in a decade before she was born. The girl who had assembled intelligence in 18 months that his people had spent years suppressing. The girl who was Raymond Calloway's granddaughter and who had inherited apparently everything that had made Raymond Calloway dangerous. He made 2 calls. The first was to a number that did not appear in any directory. The second was to Harold Voss. Voss picked up on the second ring. Marsh said she knows too much and she will find him. There was a pause on the other end that was precisely 1 second longer than a pause from a man with a clean conscience would be. Ensure she doesn't come back, Marsh said. Voss said, I understand. He hung up. He stood at his window and looked out at the November morning over Washington. The Capitol dome was visible to the south, pale against a pale sky. He had looked at that dome from this window for 22 years and had never once felt anything sentimental about it. Power did not live in buildings. It lived in the relationships between people who understood what it was worth and what it contained us. He picked up the phone again. His hand did not shake. It had not shaken in 30 years. But something else was happening inside Harold Voss that had been happening for a very long time, something that phone calls and orders and decades of institutional momentum had papered over without ever quite resolving. He had signed an order in 1993. He had told himself it was necessary. He had told himself this so many times and in so many different ways that the telling had become its own kind of truth, the kind that sits in the body even when the mind has stopped believing it. He had seen the girl in that room. He had watched her place the notebook on the table, and the paper had started to come apart. Cole Hadley had been awake when Vane made his call. He was awake because Hadley was almost always awake in the hours before an operation, not from anxiety, which was something he had largely burned out of himself over a decade of Ranger deployments, but from the habit of treating the pre-operational period as a resource. You used it for preparation, or you wasted it on sleep you wouldn't get anyway. He had heard Vane's voice through the wall of the adjacent room. Not the words, the walls were thick enough to prevent that, but the cadence. The rhythm of someone speaking in a register they were trying to keep contained. Formal, careful, reporting. He pressed his ear to the wall. He caught 3 words clearly. 2 were place names he recognized from the operational briefing. The third was Maya's call sign. He sat on the edge of his cot for 90 seconds. He was not an analytical man by nature. He was a man who moved toward problems and resolved them with the tools available. But even by those standards, what he had heard required 90 seconds of sitting still. Then he picked up the secondary radio, the one Rourke had distributed on the first day, the one that did not run through the standard communications relay, the one that existed precisely for the contingency of a standard relay being compromised and transmitted on the frequency Maya had given the team for personal emergency contact only. She answered immediately. Her voice told him she was already moving. He said, Vane just reported your position to someone outside the chain. I heard enough to know it wasn't friendly. A pause on her end that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. She said, Cole, when this is over, I owe you an explanation. You owe me a beer, he said. The explanation can wait. What do you need? When the JSOC team arrives, and they will arrive, I need you to make sure they don't have radio coordination. He understood what she was asking. He thought about the 23 years he had spent inside a chain of command he had believed in completely, and about this moment, this specific 90 seconds on the edge of a cot in southern Poland, when he discovered that believing in something completely was not the same as that thing deserving it. He had met men like Vane before. He had never liked them. He understood now why. Done, he said. In the forest road, Rourke's phone showed a blue dot moving toward a cluster of structures that registered as a hamlet of fewer than 200 people. No commercial activity, no tourism. The kind of place that persisted because the people in it had always been there and had not found a reason to leave. Maya pulled off the road where the trees thickened into a screen dense enough to conceal the vehicle from both directions. They sat for a moment. If it goes wrong, she said. It won't, Rourke said. If it does. He looked at her. The drive in the inner pocket of my kit bag has everything you've given me, plus what I pulled from the Krakow servers. It's encrypted. The key is your grandfather's service number. I memorized it. He paused. I'm not leaving without you. So it won't go wrong. She nodded, got out of the vehicle. The approach took 20 minutes through the trees. She moved the way the entry on page 7 of the notebook described moving in environments where the sound surface was complex, varying her footfall weight, using the natural cover of wind movement in the branches above to mask the sounds she could not eliminate. Rourke was behind her and slightly right, maintaining spacing, moving with the fluid silence of someone who had spent years inserting into positions in the dark. She felt the observation before she identified its source. Not a sound, not a movement. A change in the texture of the space, the way air behaves differently in an area where something animate and alert is present. Her grandfather had written about it in one of the middle entries, and she had read the description twice before she experienced it herself, and then the first time she experienced it, She knew immediately what it was. She stopped, raised her left-hand fist closed. Rourke stopped behind her. She stood still, let the feeling locate itself. Coming from the structure at the edge of the tree line, the one with the stone walls that went 3 feet into the ground, built before concrete existed to do what stone and patience could accomplish instead. She reached into her jacket, removed her sidearm, set it on the ground in front of her feet, raised both hands. She said in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as the tree line and no farther, "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here because of a photograph and because of what was written on the back of it." The forest held its silence for a long time. Then a figure appeared at the edge of the stone structure. He moved with the deliberateness of someone managing an old injury, not limping, but carrying a history in the way weight was distributed across his frame. 69 years old, gray in his hair and his beard. His left shoulder sat lower than his right in a way that no amount of time had fully corrected. He looked at her from 30 meters. The look was long and careful and contained within it something she was not prepared for, the specific pain that arrives in a face when it sees something it had given up expecting to see. He said, "You have his eyes." She had rehearsed many things she might say in this moment. All of them became inadequate simultaneously. She said, "He wrote about you." Robert Ashford walked toward her. He moved like what he was, a man who had spent a career in operational environments and had absorbed the physical cost of it and who had made some agreement with that cost, allowing him to continue moving through the world with a steadiness that was not quite peace but was adjacent to it. He stopped 6 feet away. He looked at her the way the photograph had looked at her when she turned it over, as though something on the surface of her face was carrying a message the surface wasn't aware of transmitting. "How long have you been looking?" he said. "My whole life," she said. "Seriously, 18 months. Something moved in his expression. Then he said, "Come inside." The interior of the stone structure was spare and ordered with the efficiency of someone who had lived in field conditions long enough that economy of space had become the only aesthetic that felt honest. A table, 2 chairs, a cot with a single blanket folded to military standards at its foot, a small stove working against the November cold. On the table, a satellite phone in a case that had seen considerable use. He sat. She sat across from him. Rourke remained at the entrance, back to the room, watching the approach. Ashford reached into the case beside his chair and produced a different satellite phone. He held it across the table. "There is a number programmed to the first slot," he said. "It connects for 3 minutes once a day at this time. The rest of the day, it doesn't exist." He paused. "Call it." She took the phone. She looked at him for a moment. He held her gaze without flinching. There was something in his expression she read as the resolve of someone who had made a decision before she arrived and was not going to undo it. She pressed the call button. It rang twice. The voice that answered was old, roughened by time and by whatever life sounded like when it was lived in permanent concealment. But beneath the roughness, there was a structure, a cadence, a way of forming words that she recognized without having heard it before, the same way she had recognized the face in the photograph. Not with her ears, with something older than that. The voice said Maya. Not a question. She said Granddad. The word came out of her without ceremony, without the performance of a moment she had imagined 10,000 times. It came out the way things come out when the real version of a thing finally arrives, and the imagined version simply steps aside to make room. Raymond Calloway, 73 years old, alive. Somewhere she could not identify from the quality of the connection, said, "I know what you're doing there. I've known since they put your name in the operational package. I couldn't warn you without giving away the position." She said, "Are you safe?" "For now, been safe for a long time, long as I stay invisible." A pause. The connection had the slight distortion of a signal routed through multiple relays. "You found Robert." "He found me first, technically." Something shifted in the voice. 31 years of whatever it felt like to live under a name that wasn't yours, while the people you loved continued their lives without knowing you were watching from a distance too great to close. She heard all of it in the pause before he spoke again, and she understood finally and completely the weight of the decision he had made in 1993. Not the cowardice of a man who ran from something. The calculation of a man who understood that coming home would get his family killed and staying dead was the only protection he could offer them. He had been right. He had been right for 31 years, and being right had cost him everything. "Robert saved my life," Ray said. "I had the documentation, the list. I had it on my person when they left me. They would have sent someone for it eventually, someone to make sure it never arrived anywhere that could do damage." Robert got me out before they got to me, gave me a name, a history, a place to go, in exchange for one thing. The list, she said. The list, he said, he's been using it for 30 years, not as leverage, not for money, as a map. Dismantling the network that Marsh built piece by piece using the same documentation they thought they'd buried with me. A pause. The people the agency says he's supplying weapons to, they're the people fighting against Marsh's proxies in East Africa. He's been doing what I would have done if I'd made it home, just from a different direction. She looked at Ashford across the table. He was watching the middle distance with the expression of someone listening to a conversation through a wall, aware of its existence, not trying to hear its content. She said to her grandfather, "Marsh gave the order to leave you." Marsh gave the order, he confirmed. Voss signed it. Voss was following orders from above his pay grade. At the time, Marsh was a staff director, then not yet a senator, but he had reach and money, and I had found the documentation that proved where both were coming from and where they were going. Another pause. Your father figured out most of it. By 2019, he'd gotten close enough that someone noticed. She had known this. She had known it the way you know something you have never allowed yourself to fully think, because the thinking requires accepting a particular enormity. She had known it since 2019 and had lived alongside it and kept moving because stopping was not an option she had ever seriously considered. Hearing it confirmed in her grandfather's voice was different from knowing it. She said, "I have a way to end this." A long pause. Voss, he said. He came to Warsaw himself. He didn't have to. He could have managed this from distance. He came. Be careful with that, Ray said. Men who have been waiting for a reason have often been waiting because they couldn't find one that cost them less than they were willing to pay. I know, she said, but he came. Silence on the line, the kind of silence that contains more than silence. Then give him his reason, Ray said. And come back, Maya. Whatever home looks like now, just come back. The line went quiet, 3 minutes exactly. She held the phone for a moment after the connection ended, set it on the table. Rourke said from the entrance without turning, "We have a problem." She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. Through the gap in the door, she could see movement in the tree line to the northwest. Multiple elements moving with tactical spacing, using the trees for cover, but moving too deliberately for anyone who wasn't on a timed approach to a fixed objective. She counted the gaps between the figures. 8, maybe 10. Vane had not waited as long as she had calculated. She said to Ashford, "Is there another exit?" He was already moving. East wall, stone door looks like part of the construction, comes out into the drainage channel. 40 meters into the trees on the east side. Vehicle 100 meters beyond that. "Go," she said. "Take Rourke." Rourke turned from the door. "Negative. I need a position and I need 5 minutes," she said. "You get him to the vehicle and you wait. 5 minutes." Rourke looked at her with the expression of someone running a calculation they already know the answer to. 4 minutes, he said. "Then I'm coming back." She was already moving to the corner where she had set the Remington case. The assembly sequence her hands had practiced 10,000 times, 38 seconds, from case to ready. She went to the north wall, a gap between stones at head height widened by someone who had lived here with the understanding that there would eventually be a morning exactly like this one. She set the rifle through the gap and settled behind it. The approaching team had good spacing and good technique. JSOC, she could see it in how they moved the particular economy of trained operators executing an approach on a structure they believed to be occupied by 1 or 2 individuals, not expecting them. They were right about the occupancy and wrong about the expectation. She ran the range to the tree line, 320 meters. She was not going to kill anyone. The people moving through those trees were soldiers following orders from a chain of command they had no reason to disbelieve. They were doing their jobs. The fact that their jobs were in this instance the wrong thing was not something they were positioned to know. There was a communications relay unit clipped to the belt of the lead element. She could see it through the scope, the antenna, the housing, the bulge of equipment the entire team depended on to coordinate their movement. Without it, they would have individual radios, but the encrypted coordination relay, allowing synchronized approach, would be gone. She adjusted for the angle. The wind 8 miles per hour from the northwest, minimal deflection given the direction. The cold air denser, carrying the rounds slightly higher than standard tables predicted. She made the correction. Breathed. The relay unit was approximately 4 inches by 3 inches. At 320 meters in these conditions, with this equipment, it was a difficult shot. She had made harder ones. She exhaled 60%, found the pause between heartbeats. applied pressure to the trigger with the pad of her finger, the area with the most consistent nerve density and the least tendency to create lateral movement. Her grandfather had described the technique on page 14 of the notebook. She had practiced it until the practice became invisible. The rifle spoke. The relay unit disintegrated. The lead element went flat instinctively, and the rest of the team responded by breaking spacing and taking cover, correct procedure, and exactly what she needed. In the confusion of a team reconfiguring after an unexpected shot from an unexpected direction, 30 seconds of disorientation was achievable. She needed 20. She was out the east door in 12, through the drainage channel in 8, into the tree line with the case in her left hand and the stone structure behind her and the sound of the team reconfiguring from multiple directions. She found Rourke in the trees, Ashford beside him. The vehicle where Ashford had said it would be. She got in, Rourke drove. The road east descended quickly into a valley that absorbed them within minutes, the ridge behind them, blocking the sightline from the structure. No pursuit appeared in the mirrors. The team would have to regroup, reestablish communications, and arrange new transport before they could follow. By that time, the head start would be something close to insurmountable. 20 minutes of silence in the vehicle. The mountains moving past the windows in both directions, indifferent and immense. Then Ashford said from the back seat, "What do you need from me?" She said, "Nothing. I already have what I need." She looked at Rourke. He reached into the inner pocket of his kit bag and produced the encrypted drive. She said, "I need a secure location with a satellite uplink. Somewhere it doesn't matter if people know we were there after we leave." Ashford gave directions without asking why. They drove for another 90 minutes. Harold Voss arrived in a helicopter he had requested through a channel that bypassed his normal staff, which was unusual enough that 3 people in his office had noticed, and none of them had said anything, because each had separately concluded that this was not the kind of morning where saying something was in their interest. He had been flying for 4 hours. The helicopter set down in a field at the edge of the valley in the flat open ground between the tree line and a frozen pond that reflected the white sky back at itself in a way that made the horizon unclear. He got out alone, no security detail, no aid. He walked from the helicopter with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who had made a decision and was finished making it and was now simply executing it. This was the pace he had walked at his whole career toward things never away from them. Except once, 31 years ago, he had walked away from something. He had told himself it was necessary. He had told himself this so many times and in so many different ways that the telling had become its own kind of truth, the kind that sits in the body even when the mind has stopped believing it. He had seen the girl in the room. He had watched her place the notebook on the table. He had seen in her face the thing that 31 years of institutional momentum had been papering over. He had come a long way to say something he should have said in 1993. Maya came out of the trees to meet him. They stood in the open ground with 50 feet between them. The wind came across the field with the flat persistence of a November wind in a landscape with nothing to interrupt it. The helicopter sat behind Voss with its rotors slowing to stillness. He looked at her. She looked at him. The distance between them contained 31 years of something that did not have a single name. He said, "I signed the order." She had known this. She had known it since the notebook and the research and the 18 months of preparation and the expression on his face when she said 2 words that should not have existed anymore. But hearing it said directly without qualification, without the careful architecture of deniability that men in his position spent their careers building that landed differently than knowing it had. She said, "Why?" "Because Marsh told me Calloway had gone off reservation, that what he'd found was material that would compromise ongoing operations and get more people killed if it came out." He paused. The wind crossed between them. He was convincing. He was always convincing that was what he was good at, taking a situation and describing it in the language that made you feel like the thing he wanted you to do was the thing honor required. A longer pause. "I was wrong. I knew I was wrong within a year. I've known it every day since." She looked at him. There was no performance in what he was saying. She had spent enough time in proximity to professional liars to know the difference between what performance was designed to replace and the thing itself. This was the thing itself. She said, "My father." Voss's jaw tightened. "I didn't know about your father until after. Marsh didn't tell me. He had people who handled things like that independently, without the chain of command. I found out in 2020 and He stopped. Something moved across his face. There was nothing I could say that would have been worth saying. She held his gaze. He did not look away. She said, "What's in your pocket?" He reached in slowly with the deliberateness of someone who understood that the person across from them needed to see each movement clearly. He produced a USB drive. 30 years, he said. Every order with my signature. Every communication I have documentation of. Every financial record that passed through my office, connecting back to Marsh. He paused. Including the authorization for the operation in 2019. I didn't sign it, but I have evidence of who did and under whose direction. She looked at the drive. Why now? He was quiet for a moment. The wind crossed the field. The helicopter sat behind him, fully still now. Because you walked into that room, he said, and you said that name. And I realized sitting there that the thing I'd spent 30 years believing I had buried was standing in front of me in a 26-year-old woman who had built it back from nothing. He paused. All the reasons I had told myself the good of the mission, the complexity of the situation, the lives that would have been disrupted by the truth, all of it collapsed the moment I saw her sitting at that table with her back straight and her hands folded and not a single thing in her expression that was going to give me an inch. He held the drive across the distance between them. She walked to him and took it. "I'm 63 years old," he said, "and I am tired of being the man who signed that order." She stood in front of him with the drive in her hand. She looked at him for a long moment, not with forgiveness, which was not hers to give, and not with judgment, which had already been rendered by 31 years of consequence. She looked at him with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who has found a tool and is deciding how to use it. She said, "Then stop being him." The FBI arrested Gerald Marsh on a Tuesday morning in December in his office in the Russell Building, with the Capitol dome visible through the window behind him and two agents standing in the doorway he had walked through every working day for 22 years. The charges were civilian criminal charges. Money laundering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy in the wrongful death of a private citizen, the language of statutes that existed to handle exactly this kind of case and could not be reclassified as national security matters and sealed from public view. This was deliberate. The people who assembled the case had assembled it specifically in the categories that could not be made to disappear. The case was built on the contents of two drives, Voss's, which he surrendered voluntarily and completely. And the drive Rourke had pulled from the Krakow servers, which contained 30 years of Ashford's meticulous documentation, every transaction, every name, every communication that connected Gerald Marsh to the network he had claimed for 3 decades to be fighting against. It was the largest political scandal since Watergate, and the coverage lasted for months, and most of what was covered was the part that was easy to explain. The money, the network, the influence built over 30 years on a foundation of deliberate silence. The part that was harder to explain, a Delta Force sergeant in 1993, and a notebook and a photograph and a young woman who had spent her whole life building toward a single morning in a field in southern Poland, that part existed in the record and did not go away. Truth has a way of persisting in the record even when it resists easy summary. It was specific and it was particular and it was real, and that was enough. Nathaniel Vane was taken into custody at the Polish border 48 hours after the operation by a joint team coordinating between the FBI Legal Attaché Office in Warsaw and Polish Internal Security. He was transported to the United States under a sealed warrant and charged with conspiracy and unauthorized disclosure of classified operational information. He did not contest the charges. His cooperation agreement named 7 individuals across 3 agencies who had been aware of his secondary mandate and had authorized it through channels that bypassed standard oversight. Every name on that list became a name in the congressional investigation. He received a reduced sentence. Maya did not attend the hearing. She had said everything she needed to say about Nathaniel Vane in the operational report she submitted in December, which was precise and factual and contained no language that was not necessary. Declan Rourke returned to the United States in February and filed a report with the JSOC Inspector General that was 47 pages long and included full documentation of Vane's secondary mandate and the chain of command that had authorized it. The report was classified at its highest levels and then 6 weeks later unclassified by court order and entered into the public record as part of the congressional investigation following the Marsh arrest. Robert Ashford gave a sworn deposition in a secure facility in Brussels in January. He was granted immunity in exchange for complete documentation assembled over 30 years, which turned out to be considerably more comprehensive than anyone outside his operation had understood. His operation was formally closed. The groups he had been supplying, the ones fighting against Marsh's proxies in East Africa, came to the attention of the State Department through means that did not require anyone to explain how the attention had been directed. Cole Hadley, when he learned what had happened in Poland in its full dimensions, said exactly one thing to Maya when they finally spoke in person. I knew something was wrong with Vane from the first briefing. The way he looked at you, like you were a problem to be managed. She said she knew. He said, you should have told me. She said, you needed to be able to say you didn't know for your own protection. He thought about that for a while. Then he said, okay, but next time tell me. She said there wouldn't be a next time. Evelyn Pruitt sent her a card in March. Just a card, no explanation of what she knew or didn't know, no reference to Poland or any of it. Just a card that said in Pruitt's precise and economical handwriting, you did good work. I hope you rest. She kept the card. Raymond Calloway did not come home. She had expected this in the part of herself that assembled facts and ran them through the same analytical process she applied to everything. She had not expected how it would feel to have expected something correctly and to find that the correctness of the expectation did not blunt the thing itself. He was 73 years old. He had lived under another name for 31 years. He had built a life in that name, small, invisible, contained, and the life was real in the way that all lives become real when they are lived fully enough, regardless of how they began. The name Raymond Calloway was not more real to him than the name he had inhabited for 3 decades. It was a name that existed in a past he had survived and a present he could not return to without dismantling the infrastructure of his survival in ways that were at 73 simply beyond what he was willing to do. He called her once a week. The calls lasted 3 minutes each on a rotation of numbers and connection methods that changed every time. He told her things about her father she hadn't known, about her grandmother who had died in 2003, whom he had never seen again after 1993, but had watched from the only distance available to him. About the years in Panama, before everything, when he had been young and certain in the way that people with exceptional gifts are certain before the world informed him of everything that certainty could not protect him from. She listened. She asked questions. She built from these conversations a version of him that was more complete than the one she had assembled from the notebook, and the stories and the completion of it was a different kind of weight than the absence had been. Not lighter, more specific, more real, and therefore in the way that real things are more worth carrying. She brought the notebook to Arlington on a morning in April when the trees were beginning their return to color, and the air had the quality of something that had waited long enough and was finally being allowed to proceed. She did not bring it to a grave. There was no grave. Raymond Calloway had no stone in this cemetery, no official record of rest in this ground, because Raymond Calloway had been erased from the official record of everything, including his own death. She brought it to a section where the trees were oldest and the ground had absorbed the longest accumulation of what this place held. She stood there for a while without performing anything, not ceremony, not gesture. Just standing in a place that understood what she was carrying without needing to explain herself to anyone. After a long time, she said one thing, not loudly, not with ceremony, in the same tone she used for everything that mattered, level, direct, sufficient. I found him. He's all right. She didn't know if that counted as a report or a promise or just a fact stated to the air. It didn't matter which. It was true either way. The notebook went back into her case. She picked up the case. She turned toward the gate. The call sign was in the record now. Specter 6, filed officially in the congressional investigation as the operational designation of Master Sergeant Raymond Calloway Delta Force, who had been deliberately left behind in Mogadishu in October of 1993, and who remained alive at the time of the investigation's conclusion location, undisclosed for reasons of personal security. Not dead, never dead. The record had been corrected. The name had been restored to the history from which it had been erased. The people who had done the erasing had been named in a document that would exist in the public record for as long as documents existed in public records. That was what 31 years of a carefully maintained secret looked like when it came apart. Not an explosion, not a dramatic reckoning, just a document, a set of facts, a name in a file where a name had been missing. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything her father had spent 20 years trying to find and everything her grandfather had spent 31 years protecting by staying absent from it. It was the thing the notebook had been carrying toward since the last entry was written in a hand running out of time. The gate was iron and old and opened without sound. She walked through it into the April morning, into the particular brightness of a day that had not yet decided what it was going to be. Behind her, the old trees moved in the wind. The new leaves responded to it in the way of things still becoming what they will be, bending without breaking, returning to position holding. In front of her, the street was ordinary and ongoing, and full of people living their lives without knowing what had happened in a room with no windows, in a warehouse in Krakow, in a field in southern Poland, in a filing cabinet that held a 31-year-old photograph of a man who had chosen to survive. She walked, the case in her hand, the notebook inside it. The call sign no one had said for 31 years now said, now real. Now part of a record that would not be erased. Specter 6, present, accounted for, moving forward.